So earlier today, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he is open to a ceasefire agreement that would end the war in Ukraine along the current front lines. Now, there's still some pretty significant sticking points and a lot of details worth getting into, especially around the timing of this statement. But anytime there's something that comes up that could potentially end the war in Ukraine, I feel like it's worth the discussion. So let's get into it. Now, this is coming from a report in Reuters earlier today where they said 4 Russian sources told them that Putin is ready to halt the war in Ukraine with a negotiated ceasefire that recognizes the current battlefield lines, adding that he is prepared to fight on if Kyiv and the West do not respond. Now, we've heard this before. Especially if you watch a lot of Russian media, you'll hear from Putin and Peskov, his press secretary, that they are always saying, we're open to negotiations. We want to talk with the West and Ukraine to find a way to end this war. But there's some pretty serious sticking points and hard lines in the sand here where, by and large, that's viewed as Russia wanting to end the war with things like the Ukrainian military either completely disbanding or being moved down to a few thousand strong, right? Russia having control over the government in Kyiv and certainly control over a handful of oblasts in the east. So yes, it's a negotiation, but from Ukraine's perspective, a lot of what Russia has presented at this point would just be a fancy way of saying surrender. Now, I've already seen some folks jumping to the conclusion that Putin saying this and raising the idea of a negotiated settlement means that something is not going well for Russia, that he's tapped out. He doesn't want to do this any longer. And I'd be hesitant to go that far that quickly. There's a lot of things to consider here. Big picture, I want you to think about war like gambling in a sense, right? 2 gamblers sitting down at the table, whatever game they might be playing. The outcome isn't predetermined, no matter how many resources one side or the other shows up to the table with. And something they have to consider is what they're willing to risk, what they're willing to gamble to win. Right? Rarely throughout history do we see any countries go 100% all in to a war effort. Just give literally everything they have. That's very, very rare. And usually that's when a country or a civilization's existence is at stake. That's not the case here. You could argue that's the case for Ukraine. That is not the case for Russia. Their existence is not at stake here. And we have not seen Russia go 100% all in, which raises the question then of where is that point where the war in Ukraine becomes too costly to continue. It's there somewhere. We don't know where it is, and it's entirely possible that certain things have started to trend in that direction, leading Putin to say, hey, wait a minute, if anybody's interested, we could go back to the negotiating table and talk about some sort of peace deal. Now, a couple things we don't know when viewing any of these statements coming out of Russia, or really any government for that matter, is who is the intended audience. Right, there's a couple key considerations here. Is Putin talking to the Russian people and trying to present this as hey, he's a problem solver? He wants to end the fighting. If only people will listen to me, we can find peace in our times. Is he trying to present this to an international audience, be it the West, Asia, or elsewhere? Or is he actually talking to Ukraine? Is this a message designed to get to Zelensky and the Ukrainian government? If I knew, I'd tell you, and it might better inform this video, but we don't know exactly what the audience is or what mix of those audiences Putin is talking to when he brings up this idea of a negotiated settlement. Then moving to the timing of this statement, which I think is really important and actually gives us pretty good insight as to what this possible peace deal might look like, again, based off of exactly when it was put out. So first off, let's look at Russian domestic politics. Putin was just elected, right? So it could be tempting any big overture like this to be viewed as like a campaign promise. That's not the case. Putin doesn't need that right now. You could argue that he didn't need that before the election, but he certainly doesn't need it after being reelected to office. So you can kind of write that piece off. And maybe that gives this more credibility, saying he's actually pursuing what he thinks is the right thing to do here, rather than something simply for political motives. The second piece here is that we're just about 10 to 14 days removed from Russia kicking off offensive operations in the Kharkiv region of northeastern Ukraine. This started out with a lot of questions as to what Russia was going to try to accomplish in this area. But within the last week, we've heard Putin, senior leaders inside of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and a variety of Russian mill bloggers refer to this exclusively as the creation of a buffer zone, expanding the territory, expanding the border region, if you will, to, potentially prevent a couple things: cross-border raids by Ukrainian elements and cross-border shelling or drone strikes from Ukrainian forces into the Belgorod region of Russia. That's notable, right? When you're looking at a buffer zone just being created and then immediately as it's kind of being put in place, Russia comes out and says, hey, how about a peace deal at the current line of contact? Another consideration for the timing here has to do with Ukraine and their Western partners like the United States. For a long time, it looked like the United States might not actually send any more military aid to Ukraine. And Russia had to have had that in mind. But of course, that aid package recently passed. Munitions began to arrive in country, and almost immediately, as a sign of the stockpiles that Ukraine is now accumulating, we started to see significant deep strikes by ATACMS inside of Russian-occupied territory in Crimea that have been on a near daily basis for quite a while now, and then Ukrainian drone strikes being conducted inside of Russian territory against oil refineries, factories, transportation hubs, and the like. Now, none of those strikes by themselves are going to end the war, of course, and Russia still has a lot of significant advantages over Ukraine when it comes to the execution of this war. But going back to the earlier statement about at what point does the cost become too great to continue, it's not crazy that Putin would look at these losses being inflicted in Crimea and inside of Russian territory and say, I don't want this to continue. We got to find some way to stop these deep strikes. They're not paralyzing the Russian economy or stopping the Russian military in their tracks, but that doesn't mean that they're a good thing. They're a net negative for Russia. Then the most important thing in terms of the timing here, at least to me, is that Putin just got back from a visit to China, where he said that he fully backed China's plan to end the war in Ukraine and that China fully understood this overall situation, which means that we should probably take a look at the Chinese peace proposal that they put out in February of 2023. Now, at the time, Ukrainian President Zelensky didn't entirely write this off. He said he was cautiously optimistic, I think was the term he used, and he welcomed China's involvement in trying to bring an end to the war. But he also said that it would only be acceptable if all Russian forces left occupied Ukrainian territory. And you can see that was a sticking point in February 2023. It's going to be a sticking point now. And you can see where that's going to come to light as Putin's presentation here was that he wants to end the war along the current battlefield lines. Right, there are significant portions, now a little bit of Kharkiv, but of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporozhye, all occupied by Russian forces as well as Crimea. Ukraine views those as Ukrainian territory. Russia more and more is viewing those as Russian territory. So when you get into some of these points called out by China, recognize that that's going to be a major sticking point between the two sides. Now, there were a lot of things in the Chinese peace proposal that are just kind of the whole thing, honestly, is kind of broad and generic, so I'm not going to go point by point. There are things like ceasing hostilities and resolving the humanitarian crisis or protecting civilians and prisoners of war, things that you would expect to see in any sort of negotiated settlement, nothing crazy there. But a couple that I thought were worth pointing out is, first and foremost, number one on their list is respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Saying universally recognized international law, including the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, must be strictly observed. Equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected. It's going to be hard to find a peace agreement along the current front lines and abide by the United Nations Charter. Right? Russia has occupied and annexed portions of Ukraine, taken by force portions of Ukraine. It's going to be hard to square that circle, right? A couple big pieces here also was China bringing up that they wanted to abandon the Cold War mentality, saying the security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. I feel like that's something that could be said for multiple places around the world. Of course, it applies very much to how Russia is viewing the war in Ukraine with the involvement of NATO providing or organizing the supply of weapons to Ukraine, assisting with intelligence, and then the possible path forward of Ukraine joining NATO. And this is a similar situation in Asia, where there's alliances forming either alongside China or against China. So you can see how they're trying to push back right now against this, what they're calling the Cold War mentality. They also talk about reducing strategic risks, saying nuclear weapons must not be used and nuclear wars must not be fought. The threat or use of nuclear weapons should be opposed. This has always been China's stance, and my understanding is that they never like it when Russia just kind of saber rattles around using nuclear weapons. Whether there's back and forth behind the scenes or not, it's not something that China has regularly done. And we, of course, have seen over the past few years, Russia just repeatedly, we're in the middle right now of Russia running tactical nuclear drills that they are saying is in direct response to kind of angry rhetoric by Western officials. Right, so the threat of nuclear weapons is a constant on the Russian side. China's never been a big fan of that, and from my understanding, kind of tries to prevent Russia from doing that in the future. And then China's other three portions here that I thought were significant was really hitting on the economic piece. They want to stop unilateral sanctions. They want to keep industrial and supply chains stable, and they want to promote post-conflict reconstruction. So a lot more on the economic global trade side that, it's obviously going to be a benefit to Europe and Ukraine and Russia if the war came to a close, but it would also benefit China if some of these things fell off and the global economy got back where it was prior to the Russian full-scale invasion. Now, personally, I don't know that we're a couple weeks or even months away from some sort of negotiated settlement, but again, I think it's worth bringing up anytime a leader of one of these two countries throws it out there and says we're open to talking about this, trying to end the war. I think trying to end it along the current battlefield lines is probably going to be a hard stop for Ukraine at this point. But again, either way, I think it's a net positive that conversation is happening rather than it not. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. We've done a lot about China recently, focused on kind of what throughout history has made China who they are today, conflict in the South China Sea, their relationships with Russia, and quite a bit more. Of course, if you're interested, link is in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.